In 1884-1885, the Somalis of Berbera found themselves in a very difficult position. At this point, the British are attempting to establish the British Somaliland Protectorate. And while the Somalis want to resist, they could not resist appropriately because of their love for trade. And this is what one Langton Prendergast Walsh tells us in an article that was published by the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society in 1890. Now, we are going to read a part of that article. Now, Prendergast was sent to Berbera to be the Vice Consul. And for some moment, he was almost the senior-most British officer in the city of Berbera. And he had the responsibilities of establishing the very early on structures of authority or structures of the British rule over the Somaliland. And he had been sent in anticipation of the Egyptians leaving Berbera and Zeila. This is what Langton writes about that in his article. He writes, the Senussi sent emissaries to Berbera, and we afterward ascertained from documentary evidence found on the body of a dead Mugrubi, a Western Arab, that a number of these rascals had been especially sent to create riots and disorder at Berbera. Now, this is 1884-1885. Now, the Senussi is a movement. This was a very influential movement from the Maghreb, North Africa. This movement had been founded by an Algerian theologian by the name Mohammed Ibn Ali al-Sanusi. He started this movement especially to fight off the colonization of course, Algeria. And then there were many people who followed his leadership, and they started, of course, resisting colonization in other parts of Africa. And this movement reached the Horn of Africa, actually. And that's what he's talking about. Now, there were members of this movement who sent in letters and messages to people in Berbera telling them you should resist the British. He continues, their object was to promulgate hatred against all Christians, to preach the doctrine of Africa for the Africans, and the total exclusion of the white man. So the goal, of course, of the Senussi movement, as he puts it, or as he saw it, was to create hatred against the Christians, of course, the British were, and of course, to push the narrative of Africa should be for Africans. People from outside Africa should not get involved in African affairs. Then he continues, now the Somali is at heart a trader, yet many of them, in order to show sympathy with the Mahdi and his cause, agreed not to supply camels or sheep or to allow the recruitment of drivers and coolies for the British army, then fighting Osman Digna and the dervishes at Suakin. Now, the Somalis were traders at heart. So they were business-minded. They wanted to do business, but at the same time, they wanted to resist. And actually says they did actually heed the advice of the Senussi, and they stopped providing or selling the British the things they needed, like camels. And at this point, the Dervish Wars are beginning. Actually, the Dervish Wars kind of like started officially in 1890s, and then went on up to 1920s. But seems like by as early as 1884, 1885, seems like this movement had started. Mohammed Abdullah Hassan probably was at this point pushing to have the British not colonize the land. But I need to point out that Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was not actually in the same school of thought with the Senussis. They were different, but they agreed on some things, such as having Africa for Africans. That's something they agreed upon. He continues, owing, however, to their deep-rooted commercial instincts, they were unable to bring themselves in practice to cut off trade relations with us or exclude the British from Somaliland. So, at the end of the day, commercial interest seems to have triumphed. That's what he says. Of course, there was a war that went on later on for close to 20 years. But he seems to say that since the Somalis were business-oriented, often they struggled stopping business. And I've talked about this in another video where I talked about, I think it's Richard Barton and also others. I think I've read 2 or 3 documents that talk about this aspect of the Somalis. There used to be a trade fair at Berbera that went on for many generations. Every year for like 3 months, people from around the world will travel to Berbera to sell and buy. Now, the Somalis sometimes will have their own differences, inter-clan differences, but there was one rule that will not be broken, and that is trade will not be disturbed. And sometimes when 2 clans had issues that they needed resolved, maybe through fighting, they often had to move aside to go far away from where the trade was happening, and then to solve their issues, whichever way they needed to be solved, but without interfering with the trade fair. So to the Somalis, business was very important, that even if there were differences, the business needed not to be disturbed. And I think that's what he's talking about here, that the Somalis, while they wanted or they needed to, they actually did resist the colonization by the British. They did it in a way that they were always careful that it did not affect commerce, it did not affect trade, because that to them was very important. And I think that's a cultural thing that they had carried on for generations. Yeah, so this article is part of the collection in a book titled The Somalis and Their Lands, and the book has articles that were published by the Journal Geographical Society between 1830 and 1890. You can get the book on Amazon. And if you are watching on YouTube, you can find the link in the description box or the pinned comment. And if you are watching on TikTok, you can check the bio. You can find a link there, and then you can find the place where you can get the book from. Yeah, so those are my random thoughts.